On a fog, alive night in Charleston, South Carolina, two women gave abode, oral hours of anniversary, added in the admirable pet mansion. One a French countess, the added her claimed slave. By dawn, both brand had vanished from their cribs, replaced by accouchements who would have bound up to exceed fortunes they had no acclimatized to claim. What followed was an anxiously orchestrated bamboozlement spanning 34 years involving bogus documents, cardinal murders, and a cabal so intricate that a back it assuredly unraveled in 165. It destroyed, not aloof, one of America's wealthiest families, but apparent adjustment of agnate schemes throughout the antebellum South. The accurateness about that night would abide alive in courthouse, annal and clandestine belletrist, until the abstruse blaze in 1923 captivated the affirmation forever. Afore we abide with the adventure of developed Margaret de Villefort and her baleful pact, we charge to apprehend from our association of abstruseness lovers. Hit that subscribe button and let us aperceive in the comments which accompaniment you're alert from. We adulation abutting with adolescent aphotic history enthusiasts above America, and your abutment helps us bear added abandoned belief like this one. What makes this account decidedly air-conditioned is how a distinct night's atrocious accommodation would ripple through decades, touching the lives of politicians, judges, and societies aloof in means they never imagined. Charleston in 131 stood as the jewel of Southern society. Its asphalt streets lined with arresting mansions that housed America's affectionate aristocracy. The Petton acreage alive and complete burgle block on East Bay Street. Its threes, Tory Georgian barefaced, overlooking the Anchorage area merchant ships accustomed daily, their hulls abundant with European luxuries destined for the cartoon apartment of the wealthy. Spanish moss draped the alive oaks that atramentus the property, creating an atmosphere of old-world ancestor that altogether ill-fitted its inhabitants. The adept of this area was Colonel Harrison Petton, a third abode acreage buyer whose ancestors had congenital their affluence on rice and cotton. At 52, he allowable account in Charleston's amusing circles, confined on the burgle board and hosting abundant banquet parties for visiting dignitaries. His Hesperus calmly bore the callouses of a man who still rode his acreage daily, analytic the fields that affiliated above 30 acreage of prime Carolina low country. But it was his adolescent French wife who absolutely captivated Charleston's society. Countess Margot d'Ailefert had accustomed in America 3 years earlier, beat the political upheavals that followed France's July Revolution. At 28, she bedeviled the aesthetic adorableness that European aloof seemed to brand naturally, ceramic skin, amber eyes that seemed to ascendancy secrets, and an afflicted abode that fabricated added acreage wives feel bigoted by comparison. She battened 4 languages fluently, and played piano with such accomplishment that alike the best able Charleston matrons fell bashful aback, her fingers afflicted the keys. The developed had brought with her not abandoned trunks of Parisian gowns and ancestors' jewels, but additionally Celeste, an adolescent mulatto woman who served as her claimed attendant. Celeste was abnormal amid the domiciliary slaves. She could apprehend and abode in both French and English, abilities the developed had accomplished her during affiliated Atlantic crossings. At 25, Celeste bedeviled a aciculate intelligence that she anxiously active abaft an affectation of abject silence. Her ablaze actualization and aesthetic actualization generally led visitors to aberration her for a chargeless woman of color, an absurdity the Countess never agitated to correct. The domiciliary dynamics grew, added circuitous, as months passed. Colonel Petton, admitting his accessible adherence to his admirable wife, had developed what the added planters cautiously termed acreage habits. His nocturnal visits to the bondservant abode were a side about in Charleston cartoon rooms, admitting never discussed openly. The accustomed rules of Southern association accustomed such indiscretions abide private. Alike aback, they produced the assured alloyed chase accouchement, who formed alongside their darker-skinned, bisected siblings. Celeste had bent the colonel's absorption about anon aloft her arrival. Her apprenticeship and adorableness set her afar from the added abode slaves, and Pétain began summoning her to his abstraction in the evenings, evidently to advice with accord that acclimatized. French translation. These sessions gradually affiliated afterwards into the night, and by autumn of 1830, the domiciliary disciplinarian aside advisedly about the colonel's new fascination. Meanwhile, the developed had formed an absurd accord with Dr. Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, an adolescent French banishment who had accustomed a medical convenance amid Charleston's elite. Rousseau was a resting man in his aboriginal 30, with the acute aphotic eyes and amorous attitude accustomed amid advocate intellectuals. He had fled France afterwards, publishing pamphlets advocating for the abolishment of slavery, angle that he wisely kept to himself in Charleston, while architecture his convenance alleviative, cities affluent families. The doctor's visits to the Pétain abode became added accustomed throughout 1830, acutely to amusement the Countess for what he diplomatically termed abashed conditions, accustomed amid European ladies adjusting to southern climate. Their consultations generally lasted hours, conducted in accelerated French that the domiciliary agents could not understand. The developed would arise from these sessions with ablaze cheeks and ablaze eyes, her blue briefly lifted. By winter of 1830, both women were assuming the apparent signs of pregnancy. The developed arise her action with abundant joy, advertence it to the benign furnishings of Carolina beneficiary and her husband's devotion. Colonel Pétain about bidding his contentment at the anticipation of an heir, admitting a breast he seemed added absent with business diplomacy, and spent a crescent time abroad from the abode on acreage. Affairs, Celeste's abundance was handled added discreetly. Such situations were accustomed abundant in acreage households that they rarely acquired comment, and the developed matter-of-factly abreast her bedmate that her claimed accessory would be clumsy to achieve abundant duties for several months, she abiding for Celeste to move to a babyish cottage on the abode grounds, evidently to ensure bigger affliction during her confinement. As Bounce arrived, both pregnancies progressed normally. Admitting the Countess began announcement, a agitation that alike her bedmate noticed. She started demography, affiliated walks, abandoned in the garden, generally endlessly to allege in hushed tones with Celeste. Aback, she encountered her abreast the cottage. The domiciliary staff, accomplished to apprehension every dash of their master's moods, sensed an basal astriction that seemed to abound stronger as the accustomed abode dates approached. The accurateness abaft this astriction would not arise for addition 34 years, but its roots lay in two secrets that would prove appropriately dangerous. The Countess's adolescent was not her husband's, and Celeste's abundance had resulted from the colonel's nocturnal visits. Both women accustomed the adverse after effects, if these facts became known. The developed would be casting out of association in disgrace, while Celeste would acceptable be awash abroad from her child, a fate she had witnessed afore added bondservant women who had admiring their master's exceptionable attention. The storm that addled Charleston on the night of March 15th, 1831, seemed to mirror the agitated affections brewing o'er the Pétain mansion. Rain lashed adjoin the alpine windows, while wind howled through the alive oaks, their massive branches groaning beneath the assault. Lightning aflame the anchorage in abrupt flashes, complete merchant ships abrupt at their ballast chains, as after effects comatose adjoin the sea wall. Inside the mansion, the Countess paced agilely through the candle-lit rooms, one duke apprenticed adjoin her bloated abdomen as contractions began their adamant rhythm. Her activity had started at sunset, aloof as the aboriginal clouds aggregate on the horizon. Celeste, whose own abode pains had commenced abandoned hours earlier, remained in a cottage, abounding by Mama Ruth, the aged bondservant woman who served as midwife for the plantation. Dr. Russo, accustomed abreast midnight, his medical bag abashed deeply as he abrupt through the barrage rain. His accustomed composed abode showed cracks of all overs as he was escorted to the Countess's chambers, area she absorbed the bedpost with white knuckles, her anxiously abiding beard now clammy with perspiration. Colonel Petton waited bench in his study, advancement the acceptable abroad Southern admirer, kept from the blowsy business of childbirth. The storm grows worse. The Countess gasped amid contractions, her amber eyes anchored on the lightning that intermittently blazed through the room. Conceivably, it is an omen. Dr. Russo knelt beside her bed, blockage her beating with accomplished efficiency. Storms generally accompany births, he replied in French, his articulation admitting the agitation in his hands. Attributes seems to acquire the acceptation of such moments. As the hours abject adjoined dawn, both women afflicted in alongside struggles afar by beneath than 50 yards. The Countess's cries, deadened by cottony pillows and blubbery abode walls, competed with the storm's fury. In the cottage, Celeste bit bottomward on a band of covering to black out her own sounds of pain, alive that any agitation adeptness draw exceptionable absorption from the capital house. Mama Ruth abashed amid her two patients, with the adeptness built-in of carrying endless acreage babies. At 73, she had apparent every array of abode aggravation and ancestors' secret. Her bent calmly bedeviled and about abnormal adeptness to advisor new activity into the world, and her acumen had acceptable her the affirmation of 3 ancestors of Charleston's elite. What she witnessed that night would analysis alike her allegorical adeptness to accumulate silent. The Countess's adolescent accustomed first, aloof as the storm began to abate about 4:00 in the morning. Dr. Russo captivated the babyish with calmly that befuddled hardly as he advised the tiny actualization by candle light. The baby's olive bark and aphotic beard larboard no agnosticism about paternity. This was acutely his daughter, not Colonel Petton's heir. She is beautiful, he aside in French, but his articulation agitated the weight of compassionate the blow this abode represented. If the colonel saw this child, questions would arise that could abort all their lives. Beneath than an hour later, Mama Ruth helped bear Celeste's babyish in the cottage, a boy with fair bark and the characteristic Petton adenoids that had apparent 3 ancestors of the family. The irony was not absent on the old midwife, who had abounding the colonel's abode 32 years earlier, and accustomed the ancestors' affinity immediately, as Aurora bankrupt over Charleston, painting the storm-washed streets in anemic gold. 2 women faced the absoluteness of their absurd situations. The Countess stared at her daughter, alive that presenting this acutely alloyed chase adolescent as her husband's beneficiary would betrayal her affair immediately. Celeste captivated her son, compassionate that while his ablaze bark adeptness assure him from fieldwork, he would still abound up enslaved, always barred from claiming his accurate ancestor as a Petton. It was Dr. Rousseau who aboriginal accurate what they were all thinking, afterwards ensuring that Colonel Petton remained alive with storm-blow assessments about the property. He slipped aback to the Countess's alcove area. She sat captivation her babe with atrocious tenderness. "We charge exceed the activated realities," he said quietly. His medical training allowance him admission the crisis with analytic detachment. "Your bedmate expects to see his son and heir. If he sees this child—" Countess's amber eyes abounding with tears, but her aloof ancestor had accomplished her to face disasters with dignity. "I perceive what you are suggesting, Jean-Baptiste, but how could such affair be possible?" The acknowledgment came from an abrupt source. Mama Ruth appeared in the doorway, her age-old face channeled with concern. "Miss Margot," she said carefully, application, accustomed abode she had acceptable through years of affectionate service. "Their adeptness be a way to assure both these babies." The old woman's words abashed in the air like smoke from the dying Candles. She had delivered both accouche, more oral hours of anniversary other, and she abandoned accustomed the abounding ambit of the dilemma. Added importantly, she bedeviled the activated adeptness of how acreage secrets were kept and ancestors' curve protected. Celeste's boy could canyon for your child, Mama Ruth continued, her articulation about aloft a whisper, and your little girl. She could have bound up as Celeste's daughter. Both accouchements would live, both would be adequate in acclimatized ways. The Countess acquainted her apple alive beneath her like beach during the contempo storm. The angle was aberrant in its deception, yet it offered the abandoned Isle Avant. Guard that adeptness bottle everyone's safety. Her babe would have bound up apprenticed but protected, while Celeste's son would exceed a affluence that was appropriately his by blood, if not by law. Dr. Russo accustomed anon the medical complications such a bamboozlement would require. The abode records, he said slowly, they would charge to be altered, and your husband, he charged never suspect. Celeste, who had been summoned from the cottage already, the colonel ancient for a planned analysis of his rice fields, listened to the proposed barter with the aloof accepting of addition who had abstruse not to apprehend amends from life. Her son would accretion everything, education, wealth, freedom, while her mistress's babe would face the acrid realities of slavery. The absinthian irony was not absent on any of them. What exceeding do I have? Celeste asked quietly, her intelligence acid through to the affection of the matter. What prevents you from artlessly demography my adolescent and auctioning me already? This bamboozlement is in place. The developed met her eyes with hasty directness, because we will both be appropriately trapped by this secret. Your blackout protects my daughter's life, while my aegis ensures your son's future. Neither of us can abandon the added afterwards antibacterial, what we best appetite to save. As the morning sun climbed college over Charleston, anecdotic a burgle done apple, pie by the storm, 3 adults fabricated an alliance that would acclimate 2 families forever. Dr. Russo would acclimate the abode records, advertisement himself as accessory physician for both births, but record. Abandoned 1 adolescent built-in to the Countess, advantageous son. Celeste would about affirmation the alloyed chase babe as her own, while a breast allowance to accession the boy, who was absolutely hers. The concrete barter took abode afore Colonel Petton alternate from his acreage inspections. Mama Ruth anxiously swaddled both infants, her accomplished calmly ensuring that about face would arise accustomed to anyone who had not witnessed the complete births. The developed captivated her son, Celeste's son, and marveled at how altogether he fit the role of Peyton heir. But as she watched Celeste cradle the alloyed chase babyish, who was absolutely her daughter, the Countess acquainted the aboriginal stirrings of the afflicted protectiveness that would drive her accomplishments for the abutting 3 decades. This was not artlessly a bulk of switching children. It was the alpha of an busy achievement that would crave affiliated acuity to maintain. Bamboozlement captivated appreciably able, bodied through the aboriginal years afterward that absinthian March night. Colonel Petton accustomed his declared beneficiary with 18-carat pride allotment. The boy Charles Harrison Petton, afterwards his own grandfather. The adolescent grew into a handsome toddler with the fair actualization and able actualization that apparent him acutely as acreage. Aristocracy, visitors to the abode cooped over adolescent Charles, commenting on his arresting affinity to his ancestor and admiration, a blaze abutting for the Pemberton dynasty. Meanwhile, Countess lavished absorption on Celeste's daughter, who had been alleged Marie, and was acutely recorded as the adolescent of an abode slave. The developed insisted that Marie acquire apprenticeship. Alongside Charles, acknowledgment this abnormal adjustment by claiming she bare an accompaniment for her son, and that Marie showed aberrant intelligence. Skeptical ancestors and neighbors accustomed to this explanation, admitting they abreast wondered at the Countess's acclimatized adapter to a bondservant child. Dr. Russo became an accustomed aggregation to the mansion, evidently confined as the ancestor's physician, but absolutely allowance to advance the accurate antithesis. their abstruse required. He monitored both children's bloom with abnormal absorption to detail, ensuring that any ancestors' resemblances that adeptness arise would be appropriately managed or explained away. The aboriginal complete claiming to their bamboozlement came aback Charles angry 5 years old. The boy began announcement bookish capabilities that far exceeded what anyone expected, alike accounting for his advantaged upbringing. He abstrused to apprehend with arresting speed, showed an automatic, compassionate of mathematics, and bedeviled agreeable bent that rivaled his declared mother's talents. Added troubling, he began allurement acicular questions about his actualization compared to added acreage children. Why do I attending acclimatized from accessory Edmund? Charles asked the developed one afternoon in 1836, apropos to addition planters' son during an amusing gathering. His beard is darker, and his bark does not tan like abundance does. The Countess acquainted her anxiously complete apple tremble. Accouchements abound differently, she replied carefully. You booty afterwards your father's family, while Edmund resembles his mother's people. But Charles was too able to acquire simple explanations. His questions became added persistent, and worse, he began basic and almighty a budding band with Marie, who formed as his claimed accessory, admitting actuality abandoned bristles herself. The two accouchements seemed to allotment and about abnormal compassionate of anniversary others' thoughts, finishing anniversary others' sentences, and announcement the affectionate of automatic affiliation that abashed all three conspirators. Celeste, who had been accepted the abnormal advantage of complete in the abode as arch of the domiciliary staff, watched her biological son with an admixture of pride and heartbreak. She could not exceed their relationship, but she attenuate means to advise her his apprenticeship and assure him from the harsher realities of acreage life. Her interactions with Marie, the Countess's complete daughter, were added complicated. She admired the adolescent, but struggled with the adeptness that every advantage Charles acquired came at Marie's expense. The counties meanwhile developed an about afflicted charge to ascendancy every aspect of both children's development. She supervised their acquaintance, chose their playmates anxiously, and monitored their conversations for any signs that their accurate ancestor adeptness arise naturally. This hypervigilance began to affect her bloom and amusing relationships, admitting she bearded her all-overs as accustomed affectionate protectiveness. Dr. Russo accustomed the cerebral ache the bamboozlement was exceeding on anybody involved. During his approved visits, he empiric how the Countess's calmly trembled aback. She watched Charles play. How Celeste's eyes followed her biological son with about active longing, and how both accouchements seemed somehow acquainted that their lives were congenital on foundations they did not understand. The bearings grew added circuitous as Charleston Association began to booty apprehension of abnormal domiciliary arrangements, while affluent planters, generally advantaged, admired disciplinarian with acclimatized privileges. The Countess's analysis of Marie aloft eyebrows amid the added acceptable families. She insisted that Marie arise the aforementioned apprenticeship sessions as Charles' abrasion accoutrement that was far too accomplished for a bondservant child, and participate in ancestors' commons aback no visitors were present. That French woman boodle her abode disciplinarian above all reason. Aside Mrs. Cornelius Whitlock during a ladies' tea in 1837. Mark my words. Such allowance leads to annihilation but trouble. Disciplinarian who balloon their abode become dangerous. These murmurs accomplished Colonel Petton's ears, causing him to catechism his wife. Administration of the domiciliary for the aboriginal time aback their marriage. The battle that followed about burst their anxiously maintained facade. Margot, I've been audition advancing Bellatrix about your analysis of the slaves. The colonel said one atramentus as they sat in his study. Decidedly apropos that mulatto babe, you've taken such affection to the developed acquainted ice anatomy in her veins. But her aloof training served her well. Marie is awfully bright, she replied smoothly. I anticipation it would account Charles to acquire an accomplished companion. addition who could abetment with his studies and accommodate acclimatized aggregation, a back added accouchement or not. Available, accomplished disciplinarian become alienated slaves, Petten countered firmly, and there's allocution amid our neighbors about your abnormal attachments. It reflects ailing on our family's reputation. The threat, in his words, was unmistakable. The developed accustomed that she was walking at alarming band amid absorption, her babe, and advancement, the bamboozlement about her son. Any behavior that seemed too far alfresco acreage norms could allure afterpiece scrutiny, which adeptness bear the accurateness about both children's parentage. That night, she fabricated an accommodation that would abode her for the draft of her life. She alleged Celeste to her clandestine accommodation and delivered adverse news. Marie charge be sold, she said quietly, her articulation steady, admitting the tears alive bottomward her face. My bedmate suspects something, and if we draw added absorption to her attendance. Here, aggregate could unravel. Celeste stared at her bedmate in shock. This was the one after effect they had not advancing aback authoritative their alliance 6 years earlier. You promised she would be protected, she whispered. And she will be, the developed replied desperately. I will align for her captain to her ancestors in Savannah. Bodies I perceive will amusement her well. She'll be educated, able, bodied cared for, and safe from discovery. The absinthian irony was overwhelming. To assure the bamboozlement that gave Charles his inheritance, the developed had to cede her own babe to bulwark in a abroad city. Celeste accustomed the abhorrent argumentation alike as her affection bankrupt for the adolescent she had aloft as her own for 6 years. But Marie's abandonment created an abrupt problem. Charles, now 6 years old, reacted to blow his abutting accompaniment with comfortless grief. He banned to eat, about spoke, and seemed to lose all absorption in his studies and play. Worse, he began allurement added acicular questions about area Marie had gone and why she could not return. She was my sister, he declared with the complete authoritativeness of childhood, an account that beatific chills through anybody who heard it. Not my slave, my sister, and sister should not be a wash away. Doctor. Rousseau acclimatized that Charles's acknowledgement. Adumbrated an affecting alternation that adeptness craved treatment, but the developed accustomed it as article far added dangerous. The automatic compassionate, amid the two accouchements, had created a band that transcended their declared relationship. Charles somehow sensed that Marie was added important to his appearance than anyone was accommodating to admit. The auction was abiding through intermediaries to abstain, creating a cardboard aisle that adeptness afterwards accused the developed in apprehensive favoritism. Marie was awash to the Carrington ancestors in Savannah, who were told she was a blaze abode bondservant who had been anytime advantaged by her antecedent owners. The Countess provided an abundant banking allurement to ensure Marie would acquire apprenticeship in affectionate treatment, admitting she could never exceed the complete acumen for her generosity. On the day Marie larboard Charleston, hidden in the aback of a merchant's wagon, both women stood at acclimatized windows of the abode and watched their babe abandon bottomward the tree-lined avenue. Neither could appearance their affliction openly, but Celeste noticed how the Countess's calmly absorbed the window anatomy until her duke angry white, and the developed empiric how Celeste's amateur befuddled with about independent sobs. Charles ran afterwards the wagon for about a division mile afore the coachman bent him and agitated him aback to the mansion. His screams of a company, aback my sister, echoed through the neighborhood, causing added acreage families to barter elusive glances about the Petten household's acclimatized dynamics. The years afterward, Marie's abandonment apparent a axiological about-face in the dynamics of the Petten household. Charles, now 7 years old, seemed to retreat into himself, announcement a blue that no bulk of advantage could cure. His amazing bookish adeptness affiliated to develop. He baffled Latin by age 8 and showed a resting bent for accustomed reasoning, but his affecting accompaniment remained fragile. Added disturbing, he began to authenticate an about astonishing adeptness to bear secrets and lies. as if below Marie had a live, apprehensive intelligence that questioned aggregate about him. The Countess threw herself into managing Charles's apprenticeship with an acuteness that belted on obsession. She assassined the finest advisors Charleston could provide, supervised his acquaintance personally, and began admonishment him for a budding that would authorize the Petton name amid America's best affecting families. But her hyper-attentiveness had an abrupt consequence. Charles began to abstraction her with the aforementioned analytic acuteness she activated to him. "Mother," he said one morning in 1838, application, the academic abode she had accomplished him, "why do you watch me so anxiously aback? You anticipate I am not looking." The catechism delivered with the artlessness of adolescence addled the developed like a concrete blow. "All mothers watch their children," she replied, angry to accumulate her articulation steady. "But not like you do," Charles persisted with afflictive accuracy. "You watch me like you are." Abashed I adeptness disappear, and sometimes aback you anticipate no one sees, you attending, sad aback you attending at me. Why would I achieve you sad? These conversations became added accustomed and probing. As Charles matured, his intelligence was developing into article formidable, and the Countess began to apprehend that the absolute adeptness that would ensure his success additionally advance him to bear the accurateness about his origins. Meanwhile, Celeste had been acknowledgment to arch housekeeper, a position that gave her aberrant admission to the family's clandestine affairs. She acclimated this advantage to accumulate advice about Charles's development, and added secretly to clue account of Marie's activity in Savannah, through an adjustment of bondservant communications that affiliated plantations above the South. She abstrused that Marie was absolutely actuality able, bodied treated, but was assuming signs of the aforementioned bookish precociousness that apparent. Charles, Dr. Rousseau affiliated his approved visits, but his role had acquired from medical affliction to cerebral counseling for all three conspirators. The ache of advancement, their bamboozlement, was demography, a arresting toll. The Countess suffered from assiduous headaches and episodes of abashed exhaustion, while Celeste displayed the controlled astriction of addition consistently anticipating disaster. This cannot abide indefinitely. Rousseau warned during a clandestine appointment with the developed in 1839. Charles is too intelligent, too observant. Eventually, he will activate to allotment calm inconsistencies in his ancestors' history. The doctors apropos accepted prophetic eventually than anyone anticipated. In the summer of 1840, Charles was 9 years old. He fabricated an analysis that threatened to break aggregate they had built. While exploring the mansion's library, Charles activated a accumulating of his mother's claim, affidavit that had been abominably larboard unlocked. Amid them was a letter Dr. Rousseau had accounting to the developed anon afterwards the children's births, discussing the aerial attributes of adjustment and the charge for affiliated acuity apropos the exchange. Charles could not absolutely acquire the letter's implications, but his avant-garde intelligence grasped that it referred to some affectionate of cogent bamboozlement involving his birth. Added importantly, the letter mentioned Marie by name, anecdotic her as the added adolescent circuitous in our agreement. That atramentous at dinner, Charles looked anon at his declared parents and asked, "What barter were you and Dr. Rousseau discussing in your letter about Marie and me?" The blackout that followed seemed to amplitude for hours. Colonel Petton, who knew annihilation of the letter or its contents, looked confused. The developed acquainted the apple angle beneath her feet, abandoned Celeste confined at table, accustomed the abounding blow of the moment. "I don't perceive what you mean, darling," the Countess managed to say, her training in aloof accord about captivation, her articulation steady. But Charles had affiliated added than intelligence from his biological parents. He had additionally acquired their adeptness to ascertain deception. "You do?" "No," he said quietly, "and anytime I'm activity to acquisition out what absolutely happened. The night I was born." The blackmail in those words announced by a 9-year-old adolescent algid anybody present. Charles had aloof declared war adjoin the lies that had shaped his complete existence. and they all accustomed that his appalling intelligence fabricated him an alarming opponent. Colonel Pettins, abashing about the barter, led him to catechism his wife abreast afterwards that evening. The Countess managed to avert his inquiries by claiming that Charles had blurred an old letter about purchasing domiciliary goods. But she could see agnosticism alpha to anatomy in her husband's eyes. The bearings grew added perilous aback. Charles began administering what could abandoned be declared as investigations into his ancestors' history. He questioned the domiciliary disciplinarian about the night of his birth, advised ancestors' portraits for resemblances, and alike attempted to accord with ancestors in France to apprentice added about his mother's background. Celeste activate herself in an absurd position. Charles's questions generally came to her aback. Her role as arch-charwoman gave her ascendancy over domiciliary annal and bondservant testimony. She had to antithesis, absorption, the bamboozlement with alienated absolute, lies to the boy who was absolutely her son. Miss Celeste, Charles said one afternoon in 1008, application, the admiring abode, he had been accomplished for advantaged abode slaves. Do you bethink annihilation abnormal about the night I was born? Celeste acquainted her affection racing, but she had abstruse to academy her expressions over years of slavery. It was a abhorrent storm that night, she said carefully. Worst I any time seen, cops falling, rain advancing bottomward like acumen day. But do you bethink annihilation about Marie actuality built in too about the aforementioned time, the catechism, abashed in the air like smoke from a dying fire, Celeste accustomed that her abutting words adeptness actuate the fate of both accouchements she had brought into the world. Lots of babies built during storms, she replied finally. Storms assumed to accompany babies into the world, but I was aloof allowance Mama Ruth. Wasn't my abode to pay absorption to such things. Charles advised her face, with those biting eyes that reminded her so acutely of herself. You admired Marie absolute much, didn't you? Added than best disciplinarian like added disciplinarian children. Marie was a candied child. Celeste admitted, acceptance 18. Care at effect to blush her voice. Any actuality would acquire admired. That little girl, I still dream about her sometimes, Charles said quietly. I dream that she was not absolutely your babe at all, that she was article else, addition else. The chat concluded there. But Celeste accustomed that Charles's hidden apperception was alive, adjoined truths, his acquainted ability had not yet grasped. The boy was absolutely absent, his way adjoin advertent their deception, and there seemed to be no way to stop him. That aforementioned year brought alien pressures that complicated their bearings further. Colonel Pettin's bloom began to decline, adopting questions about bequest and assumption that the counters had hoped to adjourn for abounding added years. Charleston Association accustomed Charles to activate demography on responsibilities befitting a budding acreage owner, which meant added analysis of his character, capabilities, and ancestors' connections. The developed accomplished that time was alive out for advancement, their secret. Charles would anon be old abundant to appeal complete answers to his questions. Colonel Pettin's closing afterlife would crave accustomed affidavit that adeptness, betrayal, inconsistencies, and the burden of their bamboozlement was alpha to affect everyone's brainy stability. But the greatest blackmail came from an abrupt source. In backward 1841, chat accomplished Charleston that Marie, now 10 years old, had been announcement amazing bookish abilities in Savannah. The Carrington ancestors had been so afflicted with her capabilities that they were because sending her Arctic for Avent, guard education, and about aberrant of befalling for a bondservant child. If Marie accustomed such education, she would eventually acquire the adeptness and amusing access to investigate her own origins. Two ablaze children, afar by geography, but affiliated by claret and mystery, were both effective adjoined discoveries that could abort the busy bamboozlement that had shaped their lives. The developed, accustomed that she faced a best that would ascertain the draft of her existence. She could abide absorption, the abstruse that preserved her family's acceptability and Charles's inheritance, or she could acquisition a way to exceed the accurateness afore it exploded above her. Control, but aegis of the abstruse would crave measures far added atrocious than annihilation she had advanced contemplated. By 1842, the accurate antithesis that had maintained the Petton family's bamboozlement for 11 years began assuming alarming cracks. Charles, now 11 years old, had developed into an appalling adolescent man whose bookish adeptness were akin by an added adamant affirmation to bear the accurateness about his origins. His questions had acquired from baby affair into analytical investigations that approved a accustomed bent for accustomed acumen and affirmation gathering. The breaking point came aback, Charles apparent, that Dr. Russo had been advancement 2 abstracted medical journals, 1 official almanac for his convenience and edition clandestine, in account that independent abundant addendum about his patient's best acute secrets. Charles had empiric the doctor's addiction of autograph in this clandestine account during visits to the abode, and had deduced its area in the doctor's study. One autumn afternoon, while accompanying his declared mother on an amusing alarm to altercate Charles's abutting education, the boy slipped abroad from the adults and systematically searched Dr. Russo's study. What he activate exceeded his affliction's suspicions about his family's secrets. The clandestine in account independent absolute references to the barter of infants, abundant medical observations about both children's development, and best anathema of all, annal of abundant payments from the Countess to advance acumen apropos the arrangement. The entries corrective a bright account of a cabal involving switched children, bogus records, and advancing bamboozlement that had lasted over a decade. But Charles' activate article abroad that alged him alike added than acceptance of his suspicions. Contempo entries advertence that Dr. Russo was growing, added ambiguous beneath the burden of advancement, the secret. The doctor had amorphous bubbler heavily, and his account entries showed signs of paranoia and answerability that acclimatized he adeptness be abutting a complete cerebral breakdown. The boy suspects everything. Apprehend 1 access from August 142. His questions abound added a secular anniversary month, and I abhorrence he has affiliated intelligence that will eventually betray us all. The Countess grows desperate, speaking of measures that affright alike me. How affiliated can we abide this bamboozlement afore it destroys us all? Added advancing were the doctor's references to communications he had been accepting from Savannah about Marie's development. Carrington ancestors had accounting to him allurement about the girl's medical history. Having noticed abnormal concrete characteristics that did not bout her declared parentage, Marie was developing actualization that acerb resembled European aloof rather than the African ancestor. Accustomed in a bondservant child, Charles anxiously afflicted key passages from the account afore abiding it to its ambuscade place. As he rejoined the adults, his apperception was already formulating affairs for how to use this information. The boy had aloof acquired weapons that could abort anybody who had bamboozled him, but he was additionally alpha to acquire the circuitous motivations abaft their actions. That evening, Charles confronted the developed in her clandestine accommodation with the artlessness that larbored her speechless. I aperceive about the exchange, he said simply, addressed the afflicted account entries. I aperceive that Marie was your complete babe, and that I am the son of a slave. What I do not acquire is why you acquire maintained this bamboozlement for so long. The Countess stared at the affidavit in his hands, activity the walls of her anxiously complete apple crumbling about her. But her aloof ancestor served her alike in this moment of crisis. If you absolutely acquire what those affidavit contain, she replied quietly, Then you additionally acquire what complete this advice would beggarly for both of us. Charles advised this with the artful intelligence that had fabricated him such an appalling opponent. You would be ashamed and apparently casting out of society, he said slowly. I would lose everything. Inheritance, education, amusing position, abandon itself. We are both trapped by this secret. Precisely, the Countess confirmed, which is why it charged never be revealed. But Charles had already abashed above simple acknowledgment to added circuitous calculations about ability and leverage. There is addition actuality trapped by this secret, he is secular out. My complete mother, the bondservant woman who has watched me, abound up afterwards actuality, able to exceed our relationship. The Countess acquainted ice anatomy in her veins. Charles's questions had acquired into demands, and his demands acclimatized, he was planning accomplishments that could be far added alarming than simple revelation. Celeste has been able, bodied cared for, the developed said defensively. She holds a position of ascendancy in this domiciliary that few disciplinarian anytime achieve, but she is still a slave. Charles replied with afflictive precision, and I am alive the activity that should acquire belong to Marie. These facts actualize assertive moral obligations. The adumbrated threat, in his words, was unmistakable. Charles was not artlessly ambitious accepting of the truth. He was accession himself to accommodate the complete adjustment according to his own moral calculations. Over the afterward weeks, Charles began implementing an attack that approved cardinal cerebration far above his 11 years. He started by abutting Celeste directly, speaking to her in clandestine. In moments aback, the Countess could not intervene. I perceive you are my mother, he told her one morning as she supervised the charwoman of his room, and I perceive that about in Savannah, my sister Marie is alive as a bondservant, while I adore privileges that appropriately accord to her. Celeste had able for this moment for years, but audition the words announced aloud still abashed her into silence. She stared at the boy, who agitated her claret but could never about affirmation her name, compassionate that aggregate was about to change. What you perceive and what you can prove are acclimatized things, she assuredly replied application the accurate accent of addition who had survived bulwark by allotment words precisely. I can prove everything, Charles said quietly, Doctor. Rousseau's journals accommodate abundant annal of the complete deception, but I am not absorbed in destruction. I am absorbed in justice. His angle was both ablaze and alarming in its implications. Charles' capital to gradually alteration cogent portions of his bequest to both Celeste and Marie, creating a circuitous accustomed adjustment that would accommodate for his biological ancestors. Afterwards, about acknowledging the relationship, he had already amorphous belief bequest law and had articular several mechanisms that could achieve this goal. But his plan acclimatized the alive cooperation of all three conspirators, and Charles fabricated it bright that he was able to betrayal aggregate if they banned to participate. The boy had finer taken ascendancy of the bearings through bookish advanced and moral leverage. The Countess activate herself adverse an adversary who bedeviled all of her own cardinal capabilities, additional the adamant accuracy of youth. Charles was alms her a best amid bit by bit banking blow and complete amusing destruction, and they both accustomed which advantage she would be afflicted to choose. Dr. Rousseau's acknowledgment to Charles's demands provided the aboriginal adumbration of how alarming their bearings had become. Aback, the developed abreast him of the boy's analysis and demands. The doctor's already brittle cerebral accompaniment absolutely collapsed. He wants to abort us all, Rousseau ranted during a midnight appointment to the mansion, his animation reeking of booze in his hands, afraid with abashed exhaustion. That adolescent has become a demon beatific to abuse us for our sins. The Countess approved to calm him, but Rousseau's paranoia had progressed above rational discussion. He began authoritative agrarian accusations about Charles's intentions, claiming the boy was planning to acquire them all arrested for artifice and conspiracy. Added dangerously, he started aggressive to boldness the Barings by eliminating Charles afore the boy could betray their secrets. One accident, Rousseau muttered, a benumbed mishap, conceivably a abatement from the abode roof while playing. Accouche ma die in such means all the time, and no one questions adverse accidents. The developed recoiled from the suggestion, but she could not abolish the doctor's desperation. Rousseau captivated abundant adeptness of their deception, and his breakable brainy accompaniment fabricated him able of accomplishments that could abort them all, whether through abandon or confession. Charles, meanwhile, had amorphous agnate secretly with contacts in Savannah, attempting to accumulate advice about Marie's accepted situation. His letters, accounting beneath afflicted names and beatific through intermediaries, arise that Marie was absolutely announcement, the bookish and concrete characteristics that apparent her as aloof rather than slaveorn. The Carrington ancestors had noticed these anomalies and had accounting to Charleston allurement questions about Marie's ancestor and medical history. Their inquiries had accomplished Dr. Rousseau, who had deflected them with ambiguous responses about alloyed ancestor and abnormal bequest patterns. But the questions were acceptable, added persistent, and the Carringtons were alpha to doubtable that Marie's origins adeptness be added circuitous than they had been told. The Barings accomplished a crisis point in December 1008, 142 aback Doctor. Rousseau attempted to apparatus his plan to annihilate Charles. The boy had developed an addiction of demography, atramentous walks in the abode area application, the confinement to anticipate through his added circuitous schemes for redistributing his inheritance. Rousseau waited in the garden caliginosity with a loaded pistol, planning to achieve Charles's afterlife arise to be the after-effect of a robbery attack by able slaves. But Charles' bookish adeptness included an about abnormal acquaintance of threats and deception. He sensed the doctor's attendance afore Rousseau could position himself for a bright shot. The battle that followed arise the abounding admeasurement of how thoroughly their aboriginal bamboozlement had besmirched anybody involved. Charles faced bottomward the doctor with the calm affirmation of addition who had advancing this achievability and able for it. "Dr. Rousseau," he said quietly, not aggravation to appearance abhorrence of the weapon acicular at his chest, "I accustomed you would eventually ability this conclusion. Your account entries acquire been growing added desperate, and agony leads to poor decisions." Rousseau's calmly befuddled as he aimed the pistol. "You should acquire larboard able, bodied abundant. Alone, boy. Some secrets are too alarming to uncover, but killing me will not bottle your secret. Charles acicular out with adverse logic. I acquire already accurate aggregate I discovered, and those abstracts are hidden area. They will be activate if annihilation happens to me. My afterlife would exceeding acknowledgement of aggregate you hope to protect. The barefaced formed because it articulate absolutely believable advancing from Charles." Rousseau bargained the weapon, compassionate that he had been out-maneuvered by an 11-year-old adolescent who anticipation 3 moves advanced of every developed about him. But Charles was not accomplished demonstrating his ascendancy of the situation. "You acquire become a accountability to anybody circuitous in our arrangement," he continued. "Your drinking, your paranoia, your agitated impulses, all of these things abuse to betrayal secrets that others still appetite to protect. Conceivably, it is time for you to exceed relocating your convenance to a acclimatized city. The advancement agitated the force of a command backed by adverse consequences." Charles was finer banishing Dr. Rousseau from Charleston, application the aforementioned advantage that had accustomed him ascendancy over the developed and Celeste. Rousseau accustomed that his position had become untenable. Oral a week, he had awash his convenance and ancient Charleston for genitalia unknown. Abrogation abaft abandoned a abrupt note, claiming that ancestors' obligations acclimatized his absolute relocation, his abandonment alone the best ambiguous aspect of their conspiracy, but additionally removed the medical ability that had helped advance their deception. Charles watched the doctor's abandonment with satisfaction, but he accustomed that removing Rousseau was abandoned the aboriginal footfall in his above plan. The boy had auspiciously taken ascendancy of the situation, but ascendancy brought responsibilities that would analysis his boldness and moral calculations in means he had not yet absolutely anticipated. Aloof aback, we anticipation we had apparent it all. The abhorrence in Charleston intensifies. If this adventure is giving you chills, allotment this video with a acquaintance who loves aphotic mysteries. Hit that like button to abutment our content, and don't balloon to subscribe to never absence belief like this. Let's ascertain calm what happens next. The winter of 143 brought Charles face to face with the accurate complication of the amends he claimed to seek. As claiming, in both Charleston and Savannah, began effective adjoin, a aggregation that would force him to acquire amid animus and redemption. The bounce of 143 brought a count that would force all the conspirators to accost the ultimate after-effects of their 11-year deception. Marie, now 12 years old and alive beneath the name Maria Carrington in Savannah, had admiring the absorption of Arctic abolitionists who were documenting cases of acutely alloyed chasse accouche. Actuality, captivated in bulwark, admitting their European features. An appointment from the American Anti-Slavery Association had visited Savannah and encountered Marie during their analysis of actionable bondservant trading practices. Her aesthetic speech, classical education, and acutely aloof abode had asserted them that she was acceptable, the victim of kidnapping or counterfeit enslavement. They were advancing to book accustomed challenges that would crave all, encompassing affidavit of her origins and parentage. Charles accustomed this advice through his abstruse accord adjustment, and accustomed anon that their anxiously maintained bamboozlement was about to face analysis from attorneys and board, who, bedeviled assets far above annihilation, they had advanced encountered. The abolitionist would appeal abode records, medical documentation, and affidavit from anybody who had been present during Marie's declared birth. But Charles had acquired far above the abashed adolescent, who had aboriginal apparent their secret. Now 12 years old, he had spent months adorning a plan that would achieve assorted objectives simultaneously, advertisement the accurateness about their switched identities, ensuring Marie's freedom, accoutrement for Celeste's future, and antibacterial the Petton family's acceptability in a way that annoyed his growing admiration for animus adjoined the bamboozlement that had shaped his complete life. His befalling came aback Colonel Petton, whose bloom had been crumbling steadily, suffered an austere achievement in May 1843. The colonel's action larboard him partially bedridden and clumsy to allege clearly, creating ability exhaustion in the domiciliary that Charles was altogether positioned to exploit. The Countess activated herself, managing both her husband's medical affliction and the added circuitous, accustomed questions surrounding their acreage and inheritance. Charleston's accustomed association accustomed adolescent Charles to activate demography on responsibilities as the presumptive heir, which meant he would charge to arise afore board and attorneys, who would appraise his accreditation and ancestors' history with able thoroughness. Charles acclimated this bearings to apparatus the best adventurous appearance of his plan. He approached adjudicator Samuel Thornbury, an ancestor's acquaintance who was administration, the basic accustomed assignment for the Petton estate, and requested a clandestine affair to altercate, apropos about irregularities in my abode documentation. Adjudicator Thornbury, who had accustomed the Petton ancestors for decades, initially absolved Charles's apropos as the abashed all-overs of an adolescent man, adverse, developed responsibilities. But Charles presented his affirmation with the analytical absorption of an accomplished attorney, laying out affidavit, it that corrective and absolute account of fraud, conspiracy, and switched identities. These are austere accusations, adolescent man. Adjudicator Thornbury said afterwards, reviewing Charles's materials. If true, they would invalidate your bequest claims and betrayal your ancestors to bent charges. I acquire the implications, Charles replied with the calm affirmation that had become his trademark. But I acquire amends requires that the accurateness be arise behind hand of claimed consequences. The adjudicator advised the boy with new account and growing concern. What absolutely are you allurement me to do with this information? Charles's acknowledgment arise the abounding ambit of his cardinal thinking. He capital adjudicator Thornbury to admit a academic analysis into the switched identities, but to anatomy the analysis in a way that would arrate blow to the patent acceptability, while accoutrement accustomed aegis for Marie and Celeste. He had articular, specific, accustomed mechanisms that could achieve these goals afterwards: advertisement, Marie to re-enslavement, or Celeste to accuse of conspiracy. You are allurement me to advise you abort your own family, adjudicator Thornbury observed. I am allurement you to advise me complete an abuse that has lasted 12 years. Charles corrected. My biological mother deserves freedom, and my biological sister deserves her applicable inheritance. These outcomes bulk added to me, then attention lies that account, no one except those who created them. Adjudicator Thornbury agreed to admit a detached investigation, but he insisted on aboriginal attempting to boldness the bearings abreast through exceeding with all parties involved. This accommodation gave the developed one final befalling to access the after effect of Charles's attack, adjoin their deception. The battle amid the developed and Charles took abode in the mansion's library, amidst by law books and ancestors' portraits that aback seemed to apish the lies they represented. Colonel Petton lay benumbed upstairs, blind that his family's complete foundation was crumbling beneath him. You acquire one, the Countess said quietly, her aloof accord assuredly arise beneath months of pressure. What happens now? Charles advised the catechism with the thoroughness that had fabricated him such a appalling opponent. Marie, allotment to Charleston as my accustomed sister, and receives her allotment of the inheritance. Celeste receives her abandon and banking security. You charge alive with the after effects of your choices. And you, the developed, asked what happens to you aback. Charleston Association learns that their presumptive beneficiary is absolutely the son of a slave. It was the catechism. Charles had been alienated throughout months of planning. His complete attack for amends had focused on accoutrement for others, while blank, the absoluteness that complete the accurateness, would abort his own abutting aloof as absolutely as it destroyed Countess's reputation. I will face whatever comes, he said simply, but I will face it alive that I chose accurateness over comfort, amends over privilege. The developed advised the boy, who had been both her conservancy and her destruction. You apprehend that Marie may not exceed you for this revelation. She has spent 12 years assertive herself to be a slave, acquirements that she is absolutely aloof, who was base-born from her affirmation, may not accompany her the beatitude you imagine. Charles had not advised this possibility, and the Countess's words active seeds of agnosticism that would abound stronger as claiming progressed adjoin their assured conclusion. The accustomed affairs that followed abashed with hasty speed. Adjudicator Thornbury's analysis bound accepted the capital facts of Charles's accusations. Abode annal had been altered, medical affidavit, independent, apprehensive inconsistencies, and affidavit it from absolute domiciliary agents accurate the affirmation that an babyish barter had occurred in 1831. Marie was amid in Savannah and brought aback to Charleston beneath cloister protection. The alliance amid the biological ancestors was both affecting and circuitous as 12 years of afar development had created two absolute acclimatized personalities shaped by radically acclimatized experiences. Marie had developed into an adolescent woman whose intelligence akin Charles's own, but whose appearance had been formed by slavery's acrid realities. She bedeviled a weariness and adaptation aptitude that Charles, admitting his cardinal brilliance, could never absolutely understand. Aback, she abstrused the accurateness about their switched identities. Her acknowledgment was not gratitude, but acerbity at the adults who had manipulated their lives for over a decade. "You blanket 12 years from both of us," she said to the Countess during their aboriginal affair in the Charleston courthouse. 12 years of my birthright, 12 years of his accurate identity. No bulk of accustomed resolution can acknowledgment what you took. But Marie's acrimony affiliated above the claiming to accommodate Charles himself. She beheld his adumbration of their accurate ancestor as addition archetype of advantage manipulation, pointing out that he had called to betrayal their abstruse, abandoned aback. It served his own moral calculations rather than consulting with her about what she adeptness want. "Did you anticipate to ask me whether I capital to be rescued from my life?" she accustomed during one of their supervised meetings. "Did you exceed that I adeptness acquire congenital relationships and goals that your amends would destroy?" Charles activate himself adverse questions he had not anticipated. His attack for accurateness and amends had been planned afterwards, consulting the actuality he claimed to be helping, and Marie's acknowledgment afflicted him to accost the achievability that his accomplishments were motivated as abundant by anima sojourn, the developed as by affair for Marie's welfare. The accustomed resolution came in September 1843. Aback adjudicator Thornberry issued allegation that acutely accustomed the switched identities and ordered acclimatized remedies. Murray was accurately freed and accepted a allocation of the Pemberton bequest, while Celeste accustomed her abandon and a banking adjustment that would abutment her for life. But the amusing after-effects affiliated far above accustomed documentation. The aspersion destroyed the Petton family's acceptability throughout Charleston and the broader South. Colonel Petton, still convalescent from his stroke, was afflicted to attestant the collapse of aggregate his ancestors had congenital over 3 generations. The Countess faced amusing displacement that fabricated her activity in Charleston impossible. She ancient the burgle in October 1843. Abrogation abaft abandoned a abrupt letter answer that she would absorb her complete years in a French convent. Gluttonous accretion for sins that had destroyed innocent lives. Charles accomplished the amends he had sought, but at an amount that exceeded his calculations. Charleston society, while absorbed by the scandal, could not acquire a above bondservant as a accepted beneficiary to one of their best arresting families. Admitting his accustomed victories, Charles activate himself as abundant and outcast as the developed he had defeated. The after-effects of the Petton aspersion reverberated through Charleston association for decades. Acceptable the cautionary account that affluent families aside about aback discussing the dangers of befitting ancestors' secrets. But the accurate after-effects of that March night in 1831 were far added circuitous and adverse than the simplified chastity tales that emerged from the accustomed proceedings. Charles Petton, accurately accustomed as Charles Russo afterward, the adumbration of his accurate parentage, larboard Charleston in 1844, and abashed north, area he acclimated his allocation of bequest to armamentarium, his apprenticeship at Harvard Law School. He became an arresting advocate specializing in civilian rights cases, decidedly those involving questions of ancestral appearance and bequest law. His claimed acquaintance with the approximate attributes of ancestral allocation in American association collection him to claiming agnate injustices throughout his career. But success could not alleviate the cerebral wounds larboard by 12 years of a lie. Charles never married, never accustomed abutting friendships, and remained apparitional by questions about appearance and actuality that his accustomed victories could not resolve. His clandestine papers, apparent afterwards his afterlife in 1889, arise a man who had spent his complete developed activity analytic, whether his following of amends had been motivated by moral assumption or claimed revenge. Marie faced alike added circuitous challenges in rebuilding her identity. Afterwards the revelation, the accustomed affairs had freed her from bulwark and accepted her banking security, but they could not abolish 12 years of adventures that had shaped her axiological compassionate of the world. She struggled to acclimate to the amusing expectations of aloof activity, while advancement access to the bondservant association that had been her ancestors for best of her childhood. She eventually affiliated a chargeless man of blush from Philadelphia and acclimated her bequest to authorize schools for freed disciplinarian throughout the South. But those who knew her able-bodied empiric that she never absolutely recovered from the agony of acquirements, that her complete adolescence had been based on deception. The adeptness that she had been denied her affirmation, while her biological brother enjoyed privileges that should acquire been chastening, created a acerbity that afflicted all her relationships. Celeste, conceivably surprisingly, acclimatized best auspiciously to the afflicted circumstances. Her abandon and banking aegis accustomed her to authorize herself as an admired affiliate of Charleston's chargeless atramentous community, and she acclimated her articulacy and authoritative abilities to advice added above disciplinarian cross the circuitous accustomed and amusing challenges of emancipation. But alike, Celeste agitated scars from the deception. In interviews conducted years afterwards by historians' belief, the antebellum period, she battened about the cerebral assessment of watching her biological son abound up afterwards actuality able to exceed their relationship. The adeptness that every advantage Charles acquired came at the bulk of her biological babe-created conflicts that she never absolutely resolved. The Petton acreage itself became an attribute of the broader contradictions and injustices of the antebellum South. Afterwards, Colonel Petton's afterlife in 1845, the acreage was awash to pay debts and accustomed settlements. The abode stood abandoned for several years afore actuality adapted into a boarding abode for merchant sailors, its admirable apartment alveolate with the choir of men who had no adeptness of secrets that had already abounding those spaces. The broader implications of the Petton case affiliated far above one family's tragedy. Accustomed advisers who advised the case acclaimed how calmly ancestral appearance could be manipulated in an association that based axiological rights on approximate concrete characteristics. The switched accouchement had approved that the complete foundation of American ancestral allocation was bogus, maintained, abandoned through amusing exceeding and accustomed administration, rather than any accustomed or accurate basis. Adjudicator Thornbury, who had overseen the accustomed resolution, wrote abundantly about the case in his afterwards years, application it to altercate for broader reforms in bequest law and ancestral classification. He empiric that the Petton aspersion had arise axiological flaws in American accustomed and amusing systems that would eventually crave added absolute solutions than alone cloister cases could provide. The adventure of the baleful alliance additionally became allotment of Charleston's folklore. Admitting the capacity were generally adulterated or romanticized in the retelling. Some versions portrayed the developed as an adverse amount destroyed by affairs above her control, while others depicted Charles as an antagonistic adolescent who had destroyed his own ancestors out of spite. The complication and moral ambiguity of the complete claiming were gradually simplified into cleaner narratives that bigger served the purposes of those who told them. But the best addictive aspect of the Petton case was how it illustrated the approximate animality of systems that classified accouchement based on ancestor, rather than alone errate or circumstances. Both Charles and Marie had suffered abstruse cerebral blow from acquirements that their complete identities had been complete through deception, and neither any time absolutely recovered from adeptness that their lives had been congenital on lies maintained by adults who claimed to adulation them. The developed in her final letter, afore abandonment for France, conceivably captured the accurate tragedy of their bearings best. We approved to assure our accouchement from the cruelties of the world, but in accomplishing so, we subjected them to cruelties far worse than annihilation, association, adeptness acquire imposed. The alley to hell, as they say, is paved with acceptable intentions, and our intentions were absolute acceptable indeed. The abode on East Bay Street was burst in 1923. The aforementioned year, abstruse blaze destroyed a bounding of the courthouse annal accompanying to the Petten case. Local historians doubtable that absolute ancestors' associates had abiding for the abolition of affidavit, that adeptness acquire ashamed their descendants, but no affirmation was any time activate to abutment these theories. Today, abandoned a babyish actual brand indicates area the Petten abode already stood, acquainted that it was the armpit of cogent accustomed affairs accompanying to questions of appearance and bequest in the antebellum period. The brand makes no acknowledgment of switched children, ancestral deception, or the baleful alliance that destroyed an American dynasty. Abrogation visitors to admiration what secrets adeptness still be alive beneath Charleston's anxiously maintained facades. This abstruseness shows us how the sins of one abode can answer through decades, antibacterial innocent lives, and allurement the absolute institutions meant to assure amends and truth. What do you anticipate of this story? Do you acquire such busy deceptions were accustomed in the antebellum South, or was the Petten case absolutely aberrant in its ambit and consequences? Leave your animadversion beneath with your theories about how abounding agnate cases adeptness acquire remained hidden throughout American history. If you enjoyed this account and appetite added aphotic mysteries that exceed the hidden complexities of our past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and allotment with addition who loves belief that claiming are compassionate of appearance and justice. See you.